The whole world's changing. Even I see that now. Our time is pretty much past. They don't want folk like us no more. This there rules will be damned with you. No more outlaws. No more killers. Now it's us being hunted. Oh, they ain't stopping. We went and made our choices a long time ago, so I guess we gotta pay for our sins.
Oh, Arthur. What a sad world we live in.
Well, I ain't sad, Mary Beth. Just realistic about what's coming.
This is part 2 of covering Arthur Morgan's journey and character evolution of Red Dead Redemption 2. Now if you want to start at the beginning, covering the chapters of Coulter and Horseshoe Overlook, it will be pinned down in the comment section below where you can easily find it. But today we're going to be continuing that journey, focusing our attention on chapter 3, the gang's time at Clemens Point. Clemens Point is a very subtle but powerful chapter when it comes to Arthur's relationships with other gang members. Now, some are more obvious and easily take their own spotlight, such as his time with Hosea inside the Bar of Rhodes, intentionally causing a ruckus for the Greys on behalf of the Braithwaites.
In this here bar, in this here town, are entirely free! The only rule is that you gotta drink them!
That mission easily highlights the love, admiration, and successful relationship he has with his adopted father Hosea. Most of the gang's operations tied to the Braithwaites are ran by the man that Arthur refers to with quite a level of affection as a master con artist within his journal. Then we have his time with Lenny, increasing the level of respect and bond he has with the young outlaw after acting on a tip he had, which paid off quite well for the gang. It resulted in the successful acquisition of rifles for the moment, but later turned out to be quite an effective reconnaissance mission for the gang's next hideout in light of the Pinkertons cracking down on them. Then there's the moments that aroused our suspicions, such as Arthur being kidnapped during a meeting between Colm and Dutch, with neither Micah nor Dutch curious on where he was after not showing up to their agreed rendezvous point after the meeting. Then there's the overall versatility and inner dynamics within the gang. Uncle being forced to ride out with the enforcers to lend a hand on a tip he had, only for it to turn out to be owned by Leviticus Cornwall, the very person that pushed them this far southeast. Bill defending himself for being seen as nothing more than the local idiot.
That wasn't my fault. It was just one of them things.
How come every time I get in trouble, I'm called a fool and an idiot? But when you get in trouble, oh, it's just one of them things.
Then there's Dutch's relationship with his brother Hosea and Arthur. And finally, the gang's combined retribution on a target for taking one of their own. Arthur's growing frustration with Strauss's money-lending victims is also an element. However, a major component that we cannot let get lost on us is Arthur's level of reflection that immediately begins here within this chapter. And that doesn't end with him, but extends to his younger brother, John. It's by no means a coincidence Horseshoe Overlook ends with John and Arthur's personal frustrations with each other finally laid out into the open. John had a bone to pick with Arthur for taking Jack out on a fishing trip, possibly hitting a sensitive spot in his acknowledgement on not doing right by his son or Abigail, while Arthur had his own resolved problems. The brother he grew up with, the one who Dutch took in and taught that the game comes first before anything else, made the ultimate decision of selfishness and betrayal. He decided to leave, and that created a tense feeling of resentment by Arthur on a sibling level. Never mind the code. Despite Arthur's attempts to hide his feelings behind that very thing, the fact he continued to hold it against John while everyone else, including Dutch, has seemed to forgive him betrays a lack of a strict adherence to the code they are raised on and nothing else. In that same mission, they finally get to voice their issues with one another, one in particular being a long time coming. The resentment still takes a background due to a more pressing and immediate issue. Leviticus Cornwall tracking the gang down and essentially revealing the Pinkertons now have his financial backing. The resulting bloodshed that ensued in the town of Valentine. and the gang's forced relocation echoed the days of the impromptu retreat into culture, save for their losses. They were still headed into what is for them uncharted territory, and the immediate need to lose the law. The weight of Arthur and John's relationship doesn't end with Horseshoe Overlook though. It actually bleeds into the beginning of Clemens Point, and it rears its importance in a seemingly offhand comment between Arthur and Charles when they're scouting for the gang's next hideout following Horseshoe Overlook. I've pointed out in a handful of videos before Arthur's initial refusal to help the German family save their father from bandits, how he had no personal issues with effectively condemning the terrified lone mother and her 2 children to death by sending them on their way, because he was interested more in their real estate for the rest of the Van der Linde gang. Arthur and Charles, of course, end up saving the family's father and finding the next location that'll turn out to be their hideout in Clemens Point, thanks to Charles's intervention. Chastising Arthur for being so cold-blooded and falsely claiming his refusal to help was rooted in the logic of the gang's inability to even help themselves, let alone other people. The interaction would turn into a profound occurrence that Arthur would later recall in his journal, lamenting at his instinct to think and weigh out his options before doing the right thing, as opposed to openly sharing his admiration for Charles, who's just wired to naturally do the right thing. After that profound moment that would stick with Arthur, he and Charles begin to track down the family's missing father, during which Charles brings up John, who decided it was a good idea for him to discreetly head back into Valentine to collect the money from the sheep he and Arthur sold. This triggers Arthur to not only share with Charles his unresolved resentment towards his brother, possibly even feeling a little ashamed on account of his specific wording of quote-unquote guessing he still hasn't forgiven him for up and leaving for a year.
He reckoned he'd be able to slip in and out.
Oh, well, if it's John's idea, it must be a good one.
What is it with you and him?
He disappeared on us for a while. When Jack was real young, a long while. A year or more.
He did?
And we was family, you know? Guess I still ain't fully forgiven him for that.
And it's that mentality, how Arthur's mentality ultimately begins this chapter, a far cry of how he would act and feel towards himself, towards Dutch, the gang's predicament, and most of all John, who by the chapter's climax would be the most vocal challenger of Dutch's plans, of Dutch's next move, of Dutch's ability to get them out successfully. And ironically, it's John's vocal doubt of Dutch and the event that triggers it that ultimately brings him and Arthur closer.
Bounty hunters, Pinkertons, lawmen. Everywhere we go, more and more civilization. Perhaps this is it from now on. We shall see, I guess.
I think it's best to begin with the circumstances of the gang and Arthur's unique position here within its hierarchy. Because if the gang members aren't looking to Dutch or Hosea for reassurance or insight into what exactly is going on or the gang's overall next move, then Arthur's typically the one that finds himself putting many of their worries at ease. And there were many worries. At least whispers of such, with the most prominent of which infecting Hosea and Lenny. While Hosea might have alluded to doubting Dutch and doubting the success of the promises Dutch is making to everyone, Clemens Point begins with Hosea and Lenny discussing their doubts and worries.
Do you worry that maybe we've lost our way?
How do you mean? Ignore that. I won't pretend ignorance. I know just what you mean.
Now begins with Hosea's first instinct to question Lenny's words, but he almost immediately walks it back, admitting he feels very much the same. Even so, he tries to reassure both himself and Lenny, reminding them that they've survived worse, an argument everyone from Arthur to John to Dutch clings to in order to suppress their doubts, fears, and the creeping sense of doom. But in this moment, Hosea is unwavering about two things. First, he refuses to buy into Dutch's empty talk of redemption. They all have done terrible things, and in the end, they're all doomed. Second, no matter what fate has in store, they will go down fighting. Lenny can be sure of that. As the conversation winds down, Hosea turns to Arthur asking for his thoughts. Arthur's response is blunt. To put it simply, he says killing is more his style, he doesn't think. And in that one line, Arthur's mindset is laid bare for the chapter's beginning. I'll get more into that in just a moment, but first I want to focus on Dutch. I don't believe Dutch would have ever come to the South on his own volition, even if relocation for the gang meant acquiring the breathing room the Vandalin gang needed from the people hunting them. If he had options, anywhere but here may have been the better move for him on account of his own personal disdain for Southerners. The gang's actions in Clemens Point throughout the entire chapter is fueled by a mixture of excitement at the thought of gold, personal hatred towards Southerners on Dutch's part, and the idea of taking advantage of a seemingly backwards part of the country stuck in a perpetual feud between two families that was much too easy to ignore. Of course, none of that was part of the gang's original plans until reconnaissance was done, which is fair. That does make sense. However, what I want to point out is the quick switch up in Dutch's mentality and Dutch's own positioning from this morning to how he was when he was leaving Rhodes. Now, every camp relocation the gang had made, from Coulter to Beaver Hollow, had all been reactionary. They were always on the run, forced to relocate whenever the heat from the law, their own actions, or a mixture of both became too much. But Clemens Point's beginning stands out as an example of just how plans often seem to fall right into Dutch's lap. That morning, right after Arthur sat to hear Hosea and Lenny sharing their doubts, he walks right over to Dutch, who's on the banks of the lake overlooking the water. Dutch makes it clear he is set out with no grand schemes for the day. His intent was just to relax, step back, and collect himself while enjoying a fishing trip with Arthur and Hosea. While the trio are riding out of camp, he does begin to talk of plans, of things that are cooking, but there's nothing set concretely. Whenever Arthur or Hosea begin to levy any type of genuine questions or concerns regarding Dutch's plans, he deflects. He just wants to focus on the fishing for the day. Another innocuous request, seeing how everything the gang has endured before ending up down here. Yet by the time they left Rhodes, just a short time later, Dutch carried a renewed sense of purpose, driven by the possibilities unfolding before him. He immediately gave Hosea instructions to look into the Braithwaites and Arthur to go looking into any further leads or valuable information around the Gray's family estate. In that moment, everybody, from Arthur, Hosea, Dutch, and even ourselves, gets swept up into the instant curiosity of the locals. Despite Trelawney warning of bounty hunters looking for him, Dutch's excitement of what he can do here becomes infectious. Finally, not just he had a plan, but everyone in camp had a task to begin working on. Lay low around the town of Rhodes and learn whatever they could about these warring families and the supposed rumor of rebel gold. It's all natural progression, but Dutch's focus on a fishing trip to then sending Arthur and Hosea to learn more about these families, giving us a chance to bypass the fishing trip altogether and immediately get to work, is quite coincidental when you begin to theorize a little bit. But can you really consider it theorizing when you throw in Dutch's infamous reassurance of thinking he is going to be okay after finding out about rebel gold while ingratiating himself with people he already had a low view on?
I think we are gonna be okay. I know. I always know. Whenever I got you two by my side, things are gonna be just fine.
This sense of excitement and relief that he is going to be okay has always been an interesting moment many people highlight when pointing out Dutch's own selfishness, thinking about himself and his survival over everyone else's. If we were to pay attention to the nuances within his expression, something Rockstar adds a lot of weight to throughout this game, Dutch's correction of supposedly meaning we instead of he could be possible he was just openly venting on how he finally had a plan together, a path to move forward that served as his compass on the what and the how of their next move. Or it could very well have been his selfishness of just looking out for himself. Whatever the case, it's yet another extension of Dutch's growing narcissism, which only becomes more pronounced as the story unfolds. As for Arthur, he effortlessly falls back into the role of the dutiful son, Dutch's loyal enforcer, rarely questioning his father figure's intentions in any meaningful way. If you take the time to observe the exchange between Linde and Hosea, it serves as a powerful reminder that when doubt begins to creep in, whether about themselves or Dutch, most members of the gang turn to one of two people, Hosea or Arthur. In later chapters, expressing such doubts would be seen as outright treachery in Dutch's eyes, an offense he simply would not tolerate. But at this stage, while still frowned upon, these concerns could at least be voiced. And when they were brought to Dutch's attention, he had ways of silencing them. Concrete plans, heartfelt appeals for unity, or reminders of how he had delivered them from worse. Often, it was a combination of all three. but Dutch can only be physically present for so long. As we all know, no amount of charm or reassurance, no matter how strong, can sustain blind faith indefinitely. When left alone to reflect on their journey, their circumstances, and the choices that led them here, reason and doubt inevitably took hold, forcing them to confront their own conclusions. Lenny was already doing just that. At that moment, Hosea deflected to Arthur, who brushed it off as a simple response, thinking wasn't his style. Killing was. Not long after, or whenever the player chose to begin the next mission, Dutch, with no grand plans for the day, decided to enjoy a quiet fishing trip. As the trio prepared to leave camp, Dutch, in an affectionate tone, reminded them that before anyone else, it was just the three of them. A moment that subtly reinforces Arthur's standing as not just the senior member of the gang, but as someone who might even belong to an exclusive circle alongside Dutch and Hosea. Yet despite that, neither Hosea nor Arthur took any initiative to question or doubt what they were really doing down here. From within the contents of Arthur's journal to how he questioned Dutch outright about getting involved with the local law enforcement of Rhodes, there is no discrepancy or any further insight into Arthur's feelings. The bottom line was, ingratiating themselves with the local law enforcement of Rhodes to him was outright ridiculous, especially the way Dutch went about it. While Arthur was dealing with Sadie and Pearson nearly killing each other back in camp, and then heading over to Caliga Hall to learn more information about the Greys, Dutch behind the scenes was getting closer and closer to Sheriff Gray, spinning a lofty tale about himself and his group. This will all culminate in the joke of them becoming deputized because of Dutch effectively working his magic on Sheriff Gray, but the key highlight here is the disconnect of just how far Dutch took this lie upon himself and presented the various Vanderlyn gang members in a light that he saw would best suit their purposes. And that becomes pretty clear when Arthur returns to Rhodes, only to find Sheriff Gray, who's clearly drunk, chatting with Dutch and Bill.
Arthur, you've met but not been introduced to Mr. Oh, I'm so sorry, Sheriff Gray.
How are you doing, sir?
I'm fine.
Tough business you boys had.
We did?
Oh, there's no need to pretend with me, sir. Life can be tough.
So it can.
And no man owes another anything.
No, sir.
But still, I feel you were hard done by. Losing your employment like that. But still.
This is at the beginning of the mission American Distillation. By this point, Arthur has already assumed the alias Arthur Callahan. And before you can even speak upon entering the sheriff's office, Dutch is already weaving another layer into whatever lie he's been spinning. He introduces Arthur as a seasoned hunter and killer, seamlessly building on the story he's been feeding Sheriff Gray. When the sheriff casually mentions that Arthur Callahan and his lot had some tough business, something Dutch had apparently already shared with him, Arthur would hesitate, confused, and would glance at Dutch, who subtly winks, signaling him to just play along. Then as Sheriff Gray continues rambling, expressing sympathy for their unfortunate loss of their employment, Arthur returns to Dutch again, his expression filled with silent doubt as if to ask if he was sure about this, if he really knew what the hell he was doing or what the hell he's been telling this man in Arthur's absence. A few minutes later, after Sheriff Gray takes his leave, Arthur turns to Dutch and bluntly tells him how he's lost his mind upon learning that they've been deputized. A joke the entire gang scoffs at, especially Dutch, who sees it as yet another affirmation of his supposed intellectual superiority over what he perceives as a bunch of drunken, inbred southern hillbillies. By the end of the same mission, the Vanderlyn gang sees a shipment of moonshine from an illegal Braithwaite operation. This stolen liquor becomes a valuable bargaining chip, setting the stage for the next part of Dutch's plan, which oversees Hosea tasked with introducing the gang to the Braithwaites and handling business with them, while Dutch focused his efforts on the Greys. It's still at this point neither Arthur or Hosea voice any objections, at least not yet. And the reason for it is incredibly simple. Dutch believed the Southerners were ignorant and easy to manipulate. Hosea, on the other hand, usually the more cautious one of the gang's group, became blinded by the promise of gold. And Arthur, well, he was caught between the gang's desperate need for money to fund their next escape and something far more personal. The thrill of seeing, as he put it, a young Dutch again. The way Dutch spoke after capturing the moonshine reminded Arthur of the man he hadn't heard in a long time. The leader who had always had the answers. The man who always had it all figured out. Regardless of the ridiculous decisions he seemed to be making just earlier in the same day. No matter how ludicrous it was to ingratiate themselves with the local law enforcement to allow Dutch to convince Sheriff Gray to deputize them, or no matter how outlandish of a lie and intricate of a story he's weaving to these Southerners, at least it seemed to be paying off, with Dutch seeming to be somewhat back in control and making the level-headed decision of handing things off to his more cautious and strategic partner, that being Hosea, to gather intel on a family nobody had any meaningful contact with just yet. Can we really blame Arthur for not questioning any of it, especially when the gang already had such a dismissive view of the locals? Arthur doesn't question or challenge Dutch's plan until after meeting Catherine Braithwaite and getting caught in a shootout with the Lemoyne Raiders at the Rhodes Saloon. By that point, his face had already been seen in multiple places, alongside the sheriff, at the Gray family's estate in Caliga Hall, at Braithwaite Manor, and now in a violent bar fight over free illegal moonshine in the heart of Rhodes. Despite his best efforts to begrudgingly play along with the charade Hosea tried to set up, he still had been fully exposed. Now in hindsight, it could be easily seen as a major mistake for Arthur to have personally interacted with both the Grays and the Braithwaites, switching between his alias Arthur Callahan and eventually his real name, Arthur Morgan, depending on the situation and who he was dealing with. But he wasn't the only one. Other gang members had also begun slipping, making their deception increasingly sloppy. But at this stage, it's important to remember it was all still technically in the name of reconnaissance. The shootout at the saloon happened immediately after Arthur first met Catherine Braithwaite alongside Hosea. It was the first time any Vanderlyn gang members interacted with her or cordially spoken to any Braithwaite. The gang still had no concrete proof of any hidden Confederate gold, nor had they fully secured an inroad with the Braithwaites, even though Arthur and Hosea both suspected Catherine Braithwaite of setting them up for the ambush in Rhodes. Hosea still believed they had a chance to regain some leverage. His plan was to return her stolen moonshine in the wake of the firefight in Rhodes, hoping it would earn enough goodwill to uncover real intel about the rumored Confederate gold, or hopefully finding a firm enough alliance with the Braithwaites to develop some kind of solid blueprint to move forward. Dutch, however, was beginning to shift his focus at this point. What started as careful and somewhat increasingly sloppy reconnaissance was rapidly turning into something else. Dutch was no longer interested in playing both families against each other. He was preparing now to rob them both outright. And it was that decision where Arthur first began to have a little bit of pushback, some genuine resistance against his father. Not only did he believe it was a bad idea, but he stood his ground in wake of Dutch's reasoning behind why he wanted to do it. Revenge for his father.
Before they figure out it was us that done it, and not the other lot, we'll be long gone. Think of it as payback for my daddy.
Payback? I ain't in the revenge business, Dutch. Least of all for something happened a long time ago.
Well, I guess we all gotta pay for something.
Dutch's change in plans and reasoning all came immediately after Hosea and Arthur escaped the Lemoyne Raiders and Rhodes. The position they saw themselves and the gang in was not the same as Dutch saw it, which makes all the more sense when, in the same interaction, Dutch reveals to Arthur he sent Javier and John over to the Gray's family estate. Sheriff Gray put in a good word with his father, and Dutch wanted to follow up on it, committing more of the gang's involvement with the Grays and wasting no time executing Dutch's decision to convince both families that they're here to help them, that it's the other family that's robbing them and not the Vanderlyn gang. It's a move Arthur was firmly against. I'd say this is one of the earliest examples of Arthur outright even rejecting Dutch's attempts to calm him down and win him over to his side. To see him straight up push Dutch's hand off him and continue to question if he thought it was genuinely the right move. Really, Arthur was never won over by Dutch's logic, even if it sounded good in theory. This should have been the right time for Dutch to listen to the man who had been present on both sides, for him to gather the information acquired by both Arthur and Hosea from the Braithwaites, and then make a better, much more informed decision on what to do next. Instead, however, from this point forward, all gang operations tied to both families completely ramped up. They would help the Braithwaites burn down the Grays' tobacco fields. The Grays would in turn send them to steal the Braithwaites' prized horses, all while Arthur reflects to the various gang members on the impacts of what they're doing, how they have a lot of irons in the fire, so to speak, and the families may be onto what they're doing. The Lemoyne Raiders showing up in the saloon in the town of Rhodes because of Catherine Braithwaite tipping them off could be completely open to speculation on various factors, and ultimately when boiled down to it, we just don't know. When it came to the gang meeting Tavish Gray, the man who sent them off to steal the Braithwaite's prized thoroughbred horses for the supposed price of $5,000, the price of $5,000 for some horses had Javier, John, and Arthur questioning who in the hell would pay that much for some horses. In the end, they would only get about $700, and their own feeling of how Arthur put it, being a bunch of prized idiots. They left that job feeling played, and I think it was very much a ploy by the Grays, if not to get them killed outright by the Braithwaites, then at the very least to get them to back off with a bloody nose of sorts. I've pointed out in a previous video, Arthur's private meeting with Beau Gray revealed a few key things. The Grays were quite astute for some seemingly backwards inbreds. Their part of their country, rarely if ever, got new faces, and now a bunch of oddly helpful Yankees appear out of nowhere wanting to just help them out of the kindness of their own hearts. Beau knew the gang was looking for something. Fortunately for them, he cared little about what it was. He was an outcast on account of his affair with Penelope Braithwaite, and as such, she was his only concern. Apart from him sharing what may have been seen by Arthur as an oddly perceptive view from a strange man, Beau also shared with Arthur his family lineage, commenting on how his father was Tavish Gray, and his uncle was none other than Sheriff Lee Gray. That's opposed to Dutch, who referred to as Sheriff Lee Gray as the son of Tavish, and Arthur doing the same thing. Sharing with Tavish, he's been working with his son, the sheriff. Well, it could be just the family revealing their tradition of keeping it within the family, marrying each other off to their cousins, as Beau was set to marry his cousin Matilda, and thus confusing or allowing the various Gray members to introduce themselves or each other as an aunt, uncle, sibling, or spouse. It's a bit more likely that Lee and Tavish intended to set the Vanderlyn gang up. It stands to reason if Beau was able to see the gang, or at least Arthur's dubious intentions, the rest of the Grays wouldn't be too far off from the same conclusions, especially with Arthur being seen in various places, and all of a sudden, alleged actions by the Braithwaites are ramped up, as are the Grays. Dutch may have horribly underestimated the sheriff and the family members he interacted with, but so too did Arthur, not picking up what Beau was able to see in just their first interaction together. And if he took him a little more seriously, he could have very well better informed Dutch on his decision to proceed against both families, instead of just reminding him revenge was a luxury they couldn't afford, and hoping that was enough to persuade his leader from pursuing such a foolish path forward.
Now, but nothing. Me and Dutch, and everyone who counts, we know what you do for this gang. We notice. Keep it up. You're gonna start seeing things change for you.
As Arthur followed Dutch's instructions and Hosea's lead with the Grays and Braithwaites, this chapter also marked key moments in his relationships with other gang members. It's not as attention-grabbing, but it is certainly there and does work to set the foundation for moments and actions that prove to be much more profound later. Here in Clemens Point, we see Arthur strengthening bonds, forming new ones, and even mending old wounds. Now, one of the most notable of these was his growing connection with Sadie Adler. For the first time since her husband's death, Sadie began to regain his sense of control, at least to some degree. She was growing increasingly fed up with Pearson's overbearing presence and was no longer content to be treated as helpless. What began as a simple effort by Arthur to take her out of camp for some fresh air, mainly to defuse the situation after she nearly attacked Pearson with a knife, evolved into a mutual respect and understanding between the two of them. Sadie was still finding her place within the gang, and it would be some time before she fully came into her own, but during that first outing with Arthur, she made one thing clear. She could handle herself, even if she came off as a bit of a live wire and was prone to inciting violence. She wasn't about to let anyone, Arthur included, underestimate her. Then there's his time with Charles Smith, the man that inspired Arthur to reflect on his own personal hesitation in doing the right thing. At the beginning of this chapter, or at least leading into it, Charles would prove his loyalty and respect to Arthur by saving his life from some bounty hunters that had him by his throat. Further strengthening their bond and working as a favor, Charles would later call upon in Beaver Hollow when he asked for Arthur's help with the Native Americans as a friend. And then there was Lenny. Like Charles and Sadie, he shares only one mission with Arthur, preaching forgiveness as he went. But in that brief time, his role is crucial for the gang and deepens the close relationship he and Arthur have. And the mission would begin with Lenny acting on a tip from former slaves he met in Rhodes. Lenny learned that a group of Lemoyne raiders are running weapons and occasionally sit on a stockpile of cash out in the swamps. He and Arthur would set out to rob them, and the impact of this job cannot be overstated. Their heist delivers more than just money. It arms the gang with brand new rifles and explosives, the very same ones they would later use to blast open the Valentine bank vault when they decide to return for it. More than that, it worked as a valuable reconnaissance mission. When Clemens Point was no longer a viable option for them to stay, the abandoned mansion of Shady Belle would be their next home, the very same one the two of them cleared out together. In the grand scheme of things, this wasn't just another robbery, it was a stepping stone, one that unknowingly set the gang to move quicker when the Pinkertons arrived in the heart of their camp. Of course, that only came to light later. However, in that moment, what I want to highlight with Lenny and Arthur is a seemingly small exchange between him and Arthur on their way back from securing the weapons and explosives. As they make their way back over to Clemens Point, Lenny is relieved the job paid off the way that it did. But he isn't relieved in the sense of glad that it's over. He's relieved simply for the fact of feeling he needed to prove himself as a valuable member, specifically comparing himself to Sean, who he says has been doing a lot for the gang. Lenny, from his perspective, needed this. He needed to prove that he can carry his own weight, that he's just as valuable as every other member, especially the loudmouth, pain in the ass, Sean. Arthur would immediately shut this down, not only telling him to focus on himself and what he does, but he would point out a few things with some very important reassurance.
It's good to have something to show like this.
Sean's a loudmouth bragger. Don't worry about what Sean does.
Hey, I like him, you know?
Well, so do I. Against my better judgment. Just, you worry about you. He wasn't on Leviticus Cornwall's train with me. We had to dig him out of Blackwater.
But
nothing. Me and Dutch, and everyone who counts. We know what you do for this gang. We notice. Keep it up. You're gonna start seeing things change for you.
okay then. Okay. Thank you, Arthur.
Reminding Lenny Sean wasn't there on the train with him, and really emphasizing he, Dutch, and everyone else that matters knows how much he does for the gang, just how useful he really is. It's one of the more subtle moments where I'd say Arthur really makes it a point to not necessarily comfort, but at least ease someone's doubts in themselves, which has to mean a lot for someone like Lenny, who is the youngest gang member apart from Jack. Arthur could have just responded sarcastically or talked of how this job went to quell Lenny's doubts, but instead he attacked Lenny's view head on by realistically bringing down this pedestal that Lenny has appeared to put Sean on. Yes, Sean might have been a little more useful in these last few days, but he can't forget that it wasn't Sean but Lenny who hopped on the train alongside him, and it wasn't Lenny who had to be saved from a bunch of bounty hunters, but instead it was Sean. By bringing him down to a more realistic view, reminding Lenny what he has done before in comparison to Sean, and where Sean was at the time. It might seem like a dig at Sean and may appear as if I'm looking too deep into a few small choice of words by Arthur, but everyone reassures and expresses themselves differently. And it's a small touch that's hammered home by Arthur later shaking Lenny's hand and confidently saying he always loves riding with him. This moment serves as both a confidence boost for Lenny and a reminder of Arthur's deep affection for him. Speaking of growing usefulness and mutual respect, Clemens Point offers some of the best companion activities in the game, each one revealing different sides of Arthur's personality and the unique ways he interacts with those around him. While playing dominoes with Tilly, we see Arthur's more gentler, playful side. He's amused by her frustration with Miss Grimshaw, even joking about poisoning her. Meanwhile, Bill, off in the gang's punching bag, continues to be the target of jabs, particularly during an armored wagon robbery that he planned. It was a plan put together on the spot that originally involved Tilly distracting the target, but it all fell apart as she began to tease Bill, calling him by his real name, Marion, and getting under his skin. Then there's one of the most memorable side activities in Arthur joining Sean on a stagecoach robbery, not because he wanted to, but because Sean was dragging Mary Beth along and Arthur refused to let him get her killed. It's one of the best companion moments in the game, showing Arthur's protectiveness over those he cared about, while joking about him not really being worried about Mary Beth after all, but Sean. But for all the excitement, it's the slower moments like the fishing trips that carry the most weight. Take the fishing trip with Kieran, for example. Kieran is a character easily forgotten in the grand scheme of things, captured by Arthur back in Coulter. He was initially held as an O'Driscoll prisoner until the gang set up camp at Horseshoe Overlook, where he was then used as a guide to track down Colm O'Driscoll with the intent of killing him and ending the long-standing feud between their gangs. But of course, Colm wasn't at 6 Point Cabin as they had hoped, and Arthur would have been killed if not for Kieran stepping in and saving his life, a moment that earned him a place in the Van der Linde gang. Since then, Kieran has mostly kept attending to the horses and fishing for the camp. A quiet existence that leaves him very easy to overlook. But small moments like the fishing trip he has with Arthur serves as a reminder that despite his past, he had carved out a place for himself among them, and Arthur finally acknowledges that for him. Between joking about drowning Kieran for being on O'Driscoll and awkwardly asking if he likes the fishing spot he chose, on account of witnessing a man skinny dipping nearby, Arthur's usual teasing gives way to something more sincere in the end. As they fish, Kieran shares a heartbreaking story about losing his parents to cholera, leaving him orphaned at a young age. It's a painful experience Arthur knows all too well. He too was orphaned at a young age, only saved by the chances of running into Dutch and Hosea, who took him in and taught him everything they knew and raised him into the man he is today. For a brief moment, the teasing stops, and Arthur reminds Kieran that he's not alone anymore.
So who taught you how to fish?
My pappy, mostly. I lost my mammy and pappy when I was young to cholera.
Your mammy?
Like I said, I was real young. After that, I was on my own pretty much, but I knew horses and fishing.
Well, just think now, you'll never be alone again.
He has a gang, a family of sorts, back at camp. It's a rare instance of Arthur offering reassurance, yet again, showing that beneath his gruff exterior, there's an understanding and even a quiet sense of compassion. Granted, he's knocked back into teasing Kieran again when Kieran reminds him that it's not that much of a home on account of both Bill and Sadie messing with him and continuing to threaten to kill him. This moment highlights an important aspect of Arthur's character, his willingness to extend an olive branch, even when others in the Van der Linde gang don't seem to be, and continue to remain wary. Kieran, once closer to being an enemy than a friend, has proven his loyalty and his willingness to pull his own weight. And while many still see him as an outsider, Arthur in his own way offers him a sense of belonging. And Kieran is unique in how he brings out this softer, more introspective side of Arthur, while newer members such as Sadie channel their grief into relentless determination. Kieran's experience is different. He isn't fighting to prove himself through aggression, he's simply trying to find his place within the gang. And in Arthur's quiet acknowledgement of their shared struggles, there's an unspoken understanding there. O'Driscoll or not, they've all been dealt a bad hand. And as the world continues to grow more civilized around them, they become increasingly stranded, clinging to an outlaw way of life that is only becoming more and more unsustainable. While Arthur's fishing trip with Kieran may seem unrelated, it serves as a subtle contrast to the far greater shift in Arthur's relationships, possibly the most important of which being John's. At the start of the chapter, Arthur's feelings towards John are still laced with resentment. Throughout Coulter and Horseshoe Overlook, he never misses an opportunity to remind John of his past selfishness, even going so far as to suggest that maybe things would be easier if he just decided to disappear again. But by the end of Clemens Point, that dynamic has changed. The kidnapping of Jack Marston by the Braithwaites becomes a turning point, not just for the gang, but for Arthur and John's relationship. It serves as a catalyst for several key developments: the gang's collective rage and thirst for vengeance, the depth of Dutch's wrath when he's outmaneuvered, and the fierce unity that binds them all together when one of their own is threatened. In that moment, the gang ceases to be just a band of outlaws. They become a family, focused and unwavering in their pursuit of retribution. The kidnapping of Jack wasn't just an attack, it was a violation of the gang's very sense of security. It wasn't enough for the Braithwaites to cross them, they struck at the heart of their sanctuary, taking the most vulnerable among them. Now, the weight of that offense is deeply felt, fueling the gang's collective rage. But for Arthur, beyond the fury and the need for retribution, something else shifts. His approach to John. Gone is the resentment, the jabs about abandoning his family, the passive encouragement for him to walk away again. In the wake of Jack's abduction, Arthur softens. He begins to ground John, steadying him rather than antagonizing him. He keeps an eye on him, speaks to him with a sense of patience and understanding that wasn't there before. The conversation between Arthur and John as they ride out of Clemens Point to clear Shady Belle perfectly encapsulates this shift in their dynamic. John, for the first time, lays bare his regrets, his faults, and his failures as both a father and a partner.
I treated Jack bad. Abigail, too.
I didn't want to believe he was mine. You know, when I was lost on that mountain after Blackwater, part of me thought I could just leave again and no one would ever know.
Come on, it ain't all bad. We've had a rocky run, but we'll be okay. We'll get through it.
Dutch will fix it. Dutch will come up with a big plan. Right now, every plan gets us into worse trouble. We're getting further from where we're meant to be going.
Now, you can't put all this on Dutch. You're worked up, and rightly so. Just don't get too far in your head with all this. You'll never get out.
He admits that he spent years refusing to accept Jack as his son, and now that innocent boy is suffering not because of anything he did, but because of the choices made by those around him. But John's anger isn't just directed at himself. He turns his frustration towards Hosea and Dutch, calling them master con men working their magic, who led the gang into an even worse situation than before. Sean is dead, the Pinkertons found them yet again, and this time they were bold enough to march straight into the heart of their camp. Jack has been kidnapped, and after all of that, there's no gold to show for any of it. He's angry, he's afraid, and he's drowning in guilt. Arthur, however, doesn't meet John's anger with more frustration. He doesn't challenge his grievances against Dutch and Hosea, or tell him how to bury his regret over Jack. Instead, Arthur responds with something John desperately needed: comfort. He reassures him they'll get Jack back, but none of them can help Jack if they're dead or rotting in a cell. He understands John's urgency in wanting to go out and find Jack, but they need to help themselves first. The most important thing that John can personally do right now, though, is breathe, have faith, and above all, stop thinking the way that he is. Because if he doesn't, he'll never recover from it, and in many ways, he never does. John's frustration towards Dutch and Hosea lingers well into the next chapter, and it's where his mentality and perceptions begins to change. The blind loyalty he once had for Dutch begins to crack, and for the first time, his family, Abigail and Jack, start becoming his priority. John makes this new priority clear to Dutch and to everyone else on their way to rob the Saint-Denis Bank. Seemingly for the first time, he openly defies Dutch, putting his family above the gang. Whether Dutch intentionally let John get captured during the robbery as a consequence of this disobedience is something that can be speculated on when we discuss the next chapter in the following video. For now though, Jack's kidnapping stands as a pivotal moment, one that mended Arthur and John's fractured relationship while simultaneously planting the seeds of irreparable damage between John and Dutch.
Some jobs ain't for saving. And some legacies, they are for pissing. You speak as if killing was something I cared about. Your husband knew the rules when he took that money. Now, I'm real sorry about the way things turned out, but he had a choice.
We can't close this chapter on Clemens Point without addressing the path Arthur is now set on, one that is inextricably tied to his declining health. While this may seem too early in the story to focus on his illness, the morality surrounding Arthur's actions, his growing disdain for debt collection, and his lingering ruthlessness in prioritizing the gang's survival make the moment of returning to Downs' house significant. Now, it's an event that stands on its own, but when you take a step back and take into account all of the money-lending missions and contrasting them from Horseshoe Overlook to the nature of them in Clemens Point, it begins to feel punitive in a different way. Now, within the contents of Arthur's journal, he's made it pretty clear that he's never liked going out and collecting the debts for Strauss. He's genuinely repulsed by it. It's disgusting, dirty work. He'd much rather go out and rob people. As far as he sees it, that's much more honest. And in his journal, he even recalls the way Archie, Thomas's son, looked at him the day he beat Thomas Downs half to death, writing as if he was the devil himself, and perhaps to the boy he was. But from Horseshoe Overlook to Clemens Point, the kinds of people Strauss lends money to remain the same, desperate and vulnerable. But the extent of their suffering becomes harder for Arthur to ignore, as well as the extents people would go to in order to just pay them back. You see, at Horseshoe Overlook, Arthur collected debts from Chick Matthews, Mr. Roble, Lily Millett, and he was expected to collect from Thomas Downs. Roble and Downs in particular reinforced Arthur's belief that Strauss was reckless in lending money to anyone willing to take it. Roble was an immigrant who didn't speak the language, and Downs was a dying man, both incapable of ever repaying their debts. But the other two, Chick Matthews and Lily Millett, were a different kind of problem. Chick attempted to escape and stash his money in a tree, while Arthur had to fight a man unwilling to let him collect Lily's debt. While Roble's situation was tragic, and it had to be some kind of a blow. He is in a foreign land where some man basically just robbed him of at least an heirloom of sorts. All things considered, he still seemed to be doing pretty well. He had his own home, stables, and a warm bed. What Arthur did to Downs was something else entirely, encouraging a dying man to sell his land or even his wife to settle his debt. It was cruel, even by the gang standards, and the consequences of that act would follow Arthur for the rest of his short life. But in contrast, Chick got what he deserved, and Lily's debt was almost more trouble than it was worth. In Clemens Point, Arthur has to collect the debt from Gwen Hughes, Winston Holmes, and the remaining debt from the Downs family that now continues onto his wife and son following his death. Unlike the previous bunch, Gwen Hughes, Winston Holmes, and Edith Downs all pay. Among the debtors Arthur collects from, Gwen Hughes stands out as the most repulsive. Rather than making any real attempt to repay what he owes, he resorts to grave robbing, while Arthur stands watch in the cemetery. The sheer audacity of it is enough to make Arthur audibly react in disbelief, as even he is taken back by the lengths Hughes was willing to go. Then there's Winston Holmes, whose situation is arguably more tragic. Unlike Hughes, he at least tries to make good on his debt, proposing to pay it off by hunting a rare cougar and selling its pelt. However, the plan proves fatal. He's killed in the attempt, but not before revealing to Arthur that he had no job, no income, and no realistic way to ever repay the money, especially with the crushing interest Strauss has imposed on him. These encounters only deepen Arthur's disgust on the work he's doing, making it increasingly clear that Strauss isn't just lending to the desperate, he's trapping them in impossible situations and using Arthur to break them even further. Something that's not lost on him when he revisits the Downs estate. Edith and Archie are still reeling from Thomas's death, forced to abandon their home before they've even had the chance to properly mourn him. And now Arthur arrives to take what little money they somehow managed to hang on to. While he isn't in the same dire circumstances as the Downs family, he does carry a certain level of respect when he approaches them, offering a half-hearted apology. But he doesn't sugarcoat the reason why he's here. He still needs that money. Understandably, Edith is resentful of Arthur, blaming him for practically killing Thomas and his debt. Though he quickly shifts the blame back to Thomas, reminding Edith that he knew the risks when he took the loan. When she pushes back again, arguing that Arthur had a choice just as Thomas did, Arthur doesn't deny it. Instead, he simply pleads with her to hand over the money, as if he just wants to get it over with.
You ever wonder about eternity? You should.
I hope it's hot and terrible, Mrs. Downs. Otherwise, I'll feel I've been sold a false bill of goods. Now, please, give me that money. Either you got a lazy eye or lack of respect. Which is it, boy?
I ain't got no lazy eye. No respect for the likes of you.
Well, maybe when your mother's finished mourning your father, I'll keep her in black, on your behalf. You think on that, boy?
It's interesting to consider how things might have played out if Archie hadn't been there, bringing out Arthur's aggression, calling him out for the way he was looking at him, full of quiet menace. Without that moment of tension, had it just been Arthur and Edith, would he have shown more remorse or sadness? Would he have let them go, wiping away their debt? Or would he have done the exact same thing and continued to project his own guilt, which I do believe Arthur actually does a little bit here. While I'd love to look at him as a cold-hearted outlaw, in the end he really has a heart, as Mary Linton and many of the gang's women have pointed out to him so many times before. That projection of his is especially clear in his response to Edith's pointed question about eternity. He brushes it off with sarcasm, saying he hopes wherever he's headed is hot and terrible because deep down, that's what he truly believes he deserves. The sentiment that he doubles down on and struggles to stop believing come the game's conclusion in Beaver Hollow. For all the terrible things he's done, especially to the vulnerable souls Strauss sent him after. Arthur has no illusions about where his path is leading, no matter how much he does his best to believe in Dutch and his notions about salvation. I had considered diving deeper into Arthur's capture by Colm, exploring whether it was part of a ploy by Micah to get rid of him, or how Colm's plan might have succeeded had Arthur not managed to escape. However, that territory leans more into speculation and theory. Instead, it better serves this video to focus on the broader themes at play. How the money-lending missions, the relentless southern climate, Arthur's torture and gunshot wounds at the hands of the O'Driscolls, and Sean's brutal death all share one common thread: their impact on Arthur and the gang's overall well-being. Gorma is often seen as the turning point where Arthur's declining health becomes undeniable, but I believe it's Clemens Point that marks the true beginning of the end, well before the gang itself realizes it. The chapter can be summed up as a slow descent that is only immediately realized after the kidnapping of Jack. There were brief opportunities to course correct even after Jack's safe return, but they all ultimately go ignored. The gang suffers its real casualties since Blackwater and Clemens Point. They burn the bridges in the south in the most extreme way possible, wiping out every grand roads and setting fire to the Braithwaite estate, incinerating Catherine's sons in the process. Their arrogance in believing they could outmaneuver the wealthy Southerners backfires spectacularly. In their reckless thirst for vengeance, they lash out with such force that the Pinkertons arrive almost immediately, sensing the blood in the water. This is not just another chapter, it's the moment the gang starts losing control. And beyond the chaos and violence, this chapter is most significant for the changes happening within Arthur himself. The weight of his choices are starting to settle on him, even if he refuses to fully acknowledge it. His word as a debt collector, something he once did begrudgingly and without much thought, is beginning to repulse him. The look in young Archie Downs' eyes lingers in his mind, just as a memory of Thomas Downs' coughing blood into his face lingers in his body. Arthur doesn't know it yet, but he's already paying the price for his actions. Clemens Point marks the beginning of his moral reckoning. We see him strengthening his bonds with some gang members, showing a growing capacity for care and understanding, yet at the same time we also see his cold, pragmatic side still at work, doing whatever it takes to keep the gang alive, even if it means preying on the very same weak. The struggle between the man he's been and the man he might become is already slowly unfolding before us. What happened with Thomas Downs is no longer just a job long since done and forgotten, it's a shadow creeping up behind him, a consequence yet to reveal its full weight, and by the time Arthur realizes what it truly means, it'll be far too late. By that time, Arthur would be caught in the middle, stretched and possibly thin between his own failing health, his growing concern for John, and his desperate attempts to keep Dutch from leading them all off a cliff. He's trying to balance it all, but the weight is unbearable. Dutch's decisions would grow reckless by the day, endangering not just the gang, but the Wapiti natives and even John himself. Arthur would eventually watch everything spiral out of control, and no matter how hard he tries, he can't seem to stop it. Sure, there might have been a whole plethora of regrets, ifs, wishes, and longings to do something differently, but maybe in hindsight, for us anyways, maybe him putting his foot down with Dutch in the moment where he decides to rob both the Grays and Braithwaites, maybe it all would have been drastically differently. That one decision, that one change, that could have altered everything, just as Arthur's one decision to beat Thomas Downs eventually changed everything.
I ain't in the revenge business, Dutch. Least of all for something happened a long time ago.